Good morning. I want to invite you to open with me to the book of Mark, please, chapter 7. Mark chapter 7 this morning. I really want you, if you have your Bible with you, I really want you to open to this passage with me this morning. If you don't have one, then sit close to someone that does, because I really want us to read this text together. One from Mark chapter 7 and one from Mark chapter 8. So Mark writes for us in Mark 7, verse 31, concerning Jesus, that he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. And they brought him one who was deaf and who spoke with difficulty, and they entreated him to lay his hand upon him. And Jesus took him aside from the multitude by himself, and put his fingers into his ears. And after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephphatha, which is to say, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment in his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. And they were utterly astonished, saying, He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Now move with me, if you would, into chapter 8 and verse 22. Chapter 8 and verse 22, where Mark writes the following. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought him a blind man, and entreated him to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands upon him, Jesus asked him, Do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, but I see them like trees walking about. And so again he laid his hands upon his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, Do not even enter the village. There are several reasons why I want to bring these two miracles to our attention this morning. They are unique to the Gospel of Mark. You can look in Matthew, you can look in Luke and John, and you don't find these two miracles recorded there. And not only do they have that in common, but Mark has put them at the very center of his book, here in chapters 7 and 8 of his 16-chapter book. And I want to suggest to you this morning that they are miracles that are central to the message of Mark, to what he wants to communicate to us about the ministry of Jesus, about our needs, and what they communicate about the challenge of discipleship, what we're called to in being followers of Jesus. They have some astounding similarities, these two miracles. They are alike in their brevity, but they're also, the most obvious similarity is that they are alike in how bizarre they are. I mean, Jesus, in healing these two men, goes to extraordinary measures. He is... It's unlike any other miracles that you read at all of his healings. He's theatrical here. What he does is it's over the top. It is sensational. He looks more like a modern day faith healer in the way that he handles these two men, or even like a witch doctor. I mean, he doesn't do this kind of thing when he heals people. Usually he commands them, and whatever it is departs. But here he does things that are even unhygienic. He sticks his fingers in the guy's ears that can't hear. He spits on his tongue. He puts his saliva on the tongue of the man that's deaf and who has the speech impediment. He speaks these words to him. He sighs and looks up to heaven and says, Ephphatha, which is an Aramaic word, that imperative that means be opened. And when he's dealing with the man who is blind, the healing is more protracted. Usually Jesus heals a man, and especially in Mark, immediately something happens. But in this case, he takes the man out of the village, he spits in his eyes, he puts his hands on his eyes, and then he asks them, he never does this. He says, do you see anything? And the man reports, well, I see people moving about, but it's all fuzzy. They look like trees. And so then Jesus puts his hands on him again. And then this time, the man is able to see clearly. That's not the way Jesus heals. If you were just casually reading these two stories, you might think that somehow there was something more difficult about these miracles, something more difficult about the deafness and the speech impediment of this man, or something more difficult about the blindness. But if you go to chapter 9, there is a man who is deaf, and who is mute, and who is demon-possessed, and Jesus just speaks the word and he's healed. If you go to chapter 10, there's a story about a blind man named Bartimaeus, and he comes and asks Jesus to have mercy on him, and Jesus commands the blindness away with a word. And so my conclusion can't be that the reason why this healing is more sensational and more protracted was because there was something more difficult. There's got to be some other reason why Jesus behaves in such a theatrical way here. And the thing that makes it even more astounding is, that he's not only not given to sensationalism, but there's no crowd here. He takes great constraints to make sure that these men are by themselves. In both cases, he takes the man who is deaf and who has a speech impediment, and he takes him away by himself, away from the multitude. He takes the blind man out of the village. And so he's alone with these men when he performs the miracles. And so it's not for effect, it's not for the audience. But there's something in these miracles. There's some message here that Jesus wants to say to us. They are also positioned as kind of bookends in the book. What I mean by that is there's another miracle that's between these two miracles. And so if you look at Mark chapter 8 and verse 1, we're introduced to the feeding of the 4,000. And it's a repeat miracle. This has happened before. Jesus, just 2 chapters earlier, in chapter 6, fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And in Mark chapter 8, he's going to feed 4,000. And so these two miracles are positioned on either side of that miracle. One introduces and one concludes the feeding of the 4,000. And I want to suggest to you that this morning that there's a purpose in that. There's a reason why Jesus and Mark in the story creates a sandwich with these two miracles and with the story that concerns the feeding of the 4,000. The first thing I want us to note together is how the handicap that is experienced by the deaf man who has the speech impediment and the blind man, how it is that those handicaps are similar in this respect. Think about your eyes and your ears and your mouth and what they have in common. And I want to suggest 2 things that they have in common. Our eyes and our ears and our tongues, they are the gateways to the soul. How do you learn? You learn from seeing, don't you? You learn from observing. You learn from hearing. And even your tongue is involved in learning, as you teachers know. I mean, what do you want to do with your kids? Don't you test what they've learned with questions? Don't you want them to be able to say back to you the things that you teach to them? Because part of what happens when you articulate the things that you know is that you gain a better grasp of it. And you show that you master what you learn when you're able to put it in your own words. And part of how we learn is from asking questions and from giving feedback and from conversation. And so the eyes and the ears and the tongue, they're the access points to the heart of man. We fill our minds, we fill our hearts with knowledge, with truth, with understanding through our eyes and our ears, and we share the truth that we know, and we learn to grasp it better by articulating it with our tongues. Our eyes and our ears and our tongues, they're the senses that give us access to truth and that give us the ability to digest it and that give us the ability to share it. But there's more to the eyes and the ears and the tongue. They are also the tools that God has given us for fellowship. We relate to people primarily, we connect to one another primarily through our seeing them, through hearing them, through speaking to them, don't we? I mean, they are the tools that God has given us for communication. And communication is fundamental to community. Communication is how you build a community. And not only are the eyes and the ears and the tongue, not only they are part of building fellowship to people, they're part of how we build fellowship with God. Communication is key to a relationship with God. And so here are two men, and both of them have these impediments. So often it's the case. If you look at the sick people, the people that are burdened, that are brought to Jesus, the burdens that they have, whether it's leprosy or whether it's lameness or whether it's some kind of bleeding that won't stop, or if they're blind, so often the malady that they have is a picture of how debilitating sin can be in our life. And I want to suggest to you that what we have in the picture of these two men is a picture of just how debilitating sin can be in our life. Sin, the affliction of the spiritual affliction of sin, compromises our ability to comprehend truth, and it compromises our ability to cultivate fellowship. I mean, it hits those areas that are afflicting these two men. It compromises our ability to comprehend truth, and it compromises our ability to cultivate darkness. This is what I mean. Sin creates three things in our lives that are demonstrated in the lives of these two men. Sin creates darkness, it creates deafness, and sin creates dumbness. It does all three of those things to us. Sin makes us so that we can't see. We can't see. We are blind. Sin makes us so that we can't hear. Our ears are closed to truth. And sin makes us so that we can't speak anything good, or it gives us such an impediment that we're foolish in the way that we talk. Sin affects us in that way. And it's a worse kind of darkness, it's a worse kind of deafness, and it's a worse kind of dumbness, because it doesn't just make us so that we can't see and we can't hear and we can't speak. It makes us so that we don't want to. We don't want to see. We don't want to hear. We don't want to say good things. Sin does that to us. It does it to me. And we've got to see just how terrible a malady sin is when it afflicts us in all of those ways. And I want you to see who it is that's afflicted with the malady of not seeing and not hearing and not speaking. Right in the middle of the story of the healing of these two men is the story of the feeding of the 4,000. Read just the opening verses. We're not going to read the whole story, but just the opening verses of Mark chapter 8. When Mark writes this for us, right after the man who can hear and who can't speak clearly, right after that story, it says in Mark 8 verse 1, "In those days again." What's that mean? This is a deja vu moment. I mean, we've already heard a story like this before. In those days again, when there was a great multitude and they had nothing to eat. Mark is reminding us we've been here before. If we go back to chapter 6, we see how we've been there before. There's nothing to eat. There's a great multitude. He called His disciples and He said to them, I feel compassion for the multitude because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their home, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a distance. Now, what do you expect? What might you expect the disciples to say next? Well, Jesus, we've got 7 loaves in the basket here. And so let's just bring those loaves and put them in front of you, and you can break the loaves and we'll feed them to the people, and nobody's going to go away hungry. Nobody's going to perish on the way home. We had just 5 loaves before and you fed 5,000. We've got bread to burn today. I mean, we've got 2 loaves to spare. You don't even need all 7. But we've got 7 loaves here, and we can share them with this multitude, and we can feed the people. That's not what they say. Look at what they say. In verse 4, the disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find, listen, where will anyone be able to find enough to satisfy these men with bread here in this desolate place? Anyone? Who are they standing in front of? What do you mean, where will anyone be able to find enough bread to satisfy these? And then Jesus asks the question in verse 5. He says, how many loaves do you have? They didn't volunteer them. He has to ask the question. If you go back to chapter 6, same question. How many loaves do you have? How do we get this kind of amnesia? How come there isn't a deja vu moment? How come there isn't a reminder that we've been here before and Jesus got us through it? Here we are again, and we're a lot better off than we were the last time. Well, the reason why is because they don't see that we've been here before. They don't see that the group of people that is in front of them is a more committed group than was with them a few days ago. The 5,000 has been pared down to some 4,000. And whereas with the case of the 5,000, they'd run around the sea to come hear Jesus speak, here are 4,000 people that have been walking in the wilderness. And when you think wilderness, don't think of woods. There's no shade here. They've been people that are walking in the desert for 3 years. I mean, for 3 days. It really would be some if it was 3 years, wouldn't it? 3 days they've been following Jesus in the wilderness. And so here's a committed people, but the disciples, they don't appreciate the commitment of these people that have tarried with Jesus so long. They don't feel the compassion for them. Don't they see? They don't see. Don't they hear what they're saying? Don't they hear their words and their question? Don't they hear Jesus' question? And doesn't that remind them of what happened before? It doesn't remind them. Don't they hear how foolish their talk is? We have here but 7 loaves. Don't they hear their words? They don't see. They don't hear. And they don't hear how foolish their talking is. Now, do you appreciate the crisis in Mark chapter 8 and verse 1 and following? Because the darkness and the deafness and the dumbness is not the people. It's not the crowd that is in the dark. It's not the crowd that's not listening. It's not the crowd that's speaking folly. Oh, I'm sure there was plenty of that to be had with the 4,000 that were assembled that day. But here's a problem with his leaders. Here's a problem with the 12. Here's a problem with people that know Jesus. They don't see. They're in the dark. Here are people that don't hear. They're not listening. Here are people that are talking folly. They should know better, but they don't know better. And it's not the crowd, it's the core that is stuck. How are Peter and James and John and the other 9 how they're going to help people see. I mean, how's he going to send them out to help people see if they don't see? How are they going to go help people hear if they don't hear? How are they going to teach people to speak the good news if they're speaking foolishness? And if we're going to make this applicable, how are we? How are we? If I don't see God, if I'm not seeing Him in my life, if you haven't seen Him today as we've worshiped, how are you going to show someone else to see? If there is not in my life and in your life, if there's not the habit of hearing God speak, of listening for His voice, then how am I going to teach someone else to listen? If I'm not accustomed to sharing the news, to talking about Him, if I can't articulate the truth that I've heard and that I've seen, how am I going to teach someone else to have it on their tongue? If I'm in the midst of a people who are singing a chorus of praise to God and I can't open my mouth, if I can't wag my tongue and say words that are directed to Him, that are intended to praise Him, if I don't do that here, then where am I doing that at? It's got to start with those men who know Jesus, and it's got to start with us knowing Him, seeing Him, hearing Him, talking of Him. Of all the mighty works that Jesus came to perform, I want to say to you this morning that this is the most difficult. Getting people to see, getting people to hear, and getting people to tell the story. There's nothing more difficult than that. Filling people with bread is a piece of cake. Excuse the pun. But filling people's hearts with truth, filling their ears and filling their eyes and filling their tongues, that's hard to do. That's hard to do. And it's where we are all at, is with filling ourselves up with that. And if that's going to happen, it takes extraordinary, it takes sensational, it takes invasive, it takes offensive, it takes humiliating effort on our part and on God's part for that to happen. It takes invasive procedures for God to make our eyes see and to make our ears hear and to make our tongues tell. It takes extraordinary effort, and I think that's the point of the miracles, is what lengths God has to go to and what lengths we have to go to if we're going to hear. And let me tell you what won't do it. Hanging out all day and listening to Jesus speak on the seashore, I mean all day long, being in the presence of the Master, even hanging out with Him and hearing Him speak. Hanging out doesn't do it. Now, if it doesn't do it if you're hanging out with Jesus, it ain't going to do it if you're hanging out with me. I mean, it's going to take more than that. It's not going to do it if we're just hanging out with each other. Hanging out in a religious service one day a week, when these are guys that are with Jesus 365 days a year, 7 days a week. They're eating with Him, they're sleeping with Him, they're walking with Him, they're watching Him. And there still is more required. There's effort. Hanging out won't get it, folks. And God can't grow our hearts, our eyes to see and our ears to hear, and He can't grow our lips to tell if there's not more that's happening in our spiritual relationship with Him than just hanging out on occasion with Him. Does that make sense? There's got to be more. And it's going to be invasive. And it's going to be humiliating. And what that more is, we're not going to talk about today. We'll talk about it another time. I just want you to know that there's more. I want us to feel the need for more. I want us to feel the appetite for more. I want us to want to have eyes that are open and ears that hear and tongues that want to tell. Jennifer had to go to the doctor this week and get a shot. In fact, not just one shot, she got 2 shots. Shots are invasive. Do you know that? You can't go and hang out at the doctor's office and get better. In fact, you can go, if you just go and hang out at the doctor's office, you might get more sick. There's sick people go to the doctor's office. And you know, the same thing can happen if we just come and hang out at church. There's a bunch of sinners here today. That's the one thing we all have in common. We're all a bunch of sinners. And you can get sicker by just coming and sitting and thinking about spiritual things and then going away and not taking the medicine and not taking the shot. And we need to learn about how to take the shot so that our eyes get better and that our ears get better and our tongues get better. We're going to sing a song to invite anyone that needs to come to the Lord today to give you the opportunity to do that. I want to give an anti-invitation this morning. This is what I mean. If you don't want to see, then don't come. Stay where you are. If you don't want to hear, then you might as well just go. Just go ahead and get in the car and leave. If you don't want to have a tongue that praises God, then don't come forward. Does that make sense? I mean, we got to really want this. We got to really want to see, and we got to really want to hear, and we got to really want to tell. And I am not your friend. I am not your brother. I am not any good to you if I don't urge us to want to see and to want to hear and to want to tell. Because this Jesus, He is awesome. Where do we go without Him? How do we see if He doesn't make us see? And how do we hear? What good do we have to say to anyone if it's not the news that He puts on our tongues? If you have a need this hour for Him in your life, there's a need for change in your life, make a decision today, would you? As we stand and as we sing.